My name is Sinead McBurty. I'm the Chief Executive at Education Support and really delighted to be here and doing this jointly with NASS today. We all know, so we hear so much about the impact of what's going on with SEND in the sector, the relationship between the failure of our system to support the needs of children and young people and the well-being of professionals is a massive theme. It comes through our surveys, it comes through our focus groups. So to have the opportunity to talk about issues of teacher well-being with this fantastic panel in mainstream settings, but in special school settings as well, feels like a real privilege. And clearly enough of you think that's an interesting topic as well. There is, of course, the other aspect of this, which is that relationship between the unmet need of our children and young people and behavior, which comes up repeatedly again in the research work that we do. So I imagine we'll hear a little bit about that today. But before we launch in, let me introduce this tremendous panel that's here today. So you've already heard from Claire Dorer, who's the Chief Executive of NASS. Claire started her life as a psychologist. I imagine those are skills she continues to use on a routine basis, and has worked in child and adolescent settings as well as adult mental health services. Um, with NASS, Claire has worked with over 440 special schools, reaching over 10,000 children and young people with complex needs. We're particularly delighted to have partnered before now with NASS around our shared interest, and alongside also our super duper partners at Talking Heads Supervision. And we may end up talking about some of that work today. So welcome, Claire. We have on the panel Lynn Howe. Lynn is a Senko, as well as a Senko trainer and author. And she somehow, I don't know quite how you do this, Lynn, and look so youthful, but you allegedly have 24 years of primary teaching experience.
I'm
As
43.
well, listen, I'm clearly drinking the wrong tea. And SLT experience, having been an assistant head and a lead mentor for ITT, as well as a Senko across mainstream, nursery, enhanced, and specialist provisions. Lynn's got a blog, positiveyoungmind.com, around SEMH and staff mental health. And also has a Facebook page endearingly titled The Sweary Senko. So, look out for that. We've got Elizabeth Farndon, who's a head. Elizabeth's worked in a variety of settings and has particular expertise around working with children with SEN and autism in particular. And she's been doing this work for over 20 years. Also has worked in mainstream, in local authority SEN services and maintained special and currently a special free school as well. She was the first head at Forest Bridge School, leading the development of of the special free school there, focused on children with autism. Currently has 123 pupils on roll, with over 140 staff. From a wide variety of specialisms. And in her free time, which she must have in abundance given what she does, she also is the chair of trustees for NASS. So welcome, Elizabeth.
Hi, everyone.
And finally, last but not least, delighted to see Becky Kent here. Becky is a teacher who's been in education for 10 years. She started out as a learning support assistant. I think we'll make good use of that expertise today, I'm sure, in mainstream secondary. But and also then worked as a maths and psychology teacher. She currently works as head of a sixth form at Cotswolds Chine School. And I think again we are so lucky to have a panel here today, which is bringing real practice from real life settings and expertise to share on the topics that we're here to discuss. So really delighted to welcome everybody. Um, I want to just highlight, I can see there's a stack of folks who've put their information in the chat there. and we've got a real variety of people in different settings. And also, we're getting right across the country. Shout out to Wales. I'm seeing a lot of Wales in the room, loving that. So fantastic to see so many of you. Keep adding if you haven't tapped your information in there, but super helpful. Northern Ireland, we're getting across the whole of the UK, across England. Brilliant to see. I will also say to you that we have a really full agenda of conversational topics that we want to have. But of course, you and let me be clear. I'll be getting in quickly with my questions. But you who have joined this webinar might have burning questions that you want to ask. So feel free to dive in as soon as you want when you've got questions, and I'll do my best to make sure that we pick those up and answer them as well as we can. I will also flag that education support has a helpline that's available 24/7, 08000 562 561. You don't need to remember that. Once the chat has calmed down with the introductions, my colleagues will post that number into the chat. But I say that because sometimes when we have conversations about the work and about the challenges of work, people can find themselves having a lot of feeling in response to that. And if that's a situation you find yourself in and you would like to have the opportunity to talk to someone, please know that our counselling team is available and there for just that purpose, and would be more than delighted to hear from you. So now that we've said all that and got through the introductions and the housekeeping, I'm going to start by inviting the panel to share their thoughts. And Claire, I might start with you if you are up for it. But the question is around what are the key challenges and issues that staff working with pupils who have special educational needs or disabilities, but working with that pupil group, what are the challenges that staff face in special schools and mainstream settings? And then colleagues, Lynn, Elizabeth, and Becky, I'll ask you to add your reflections and maybe build on what Claire has to say. But let's start there. Claire.
I think the first thing I'd say is you don't escape any of the general challenges that you get from being in education, and you probably get a few more extra bonus ones as well. I think it's always difficult to really generalize, but we know that sometimes working with children with special educational needs can be challenging, especially if you're in a setting where you're not always able to meet needs. And I think there'll be staff from mainstream settings who really feel that today and feel isolated. I think for a lot of the special schools that NASS works with, the sheer complexity and level of distress experienced by some of the children, particularly when they first arrive in school, means that you are in a high stress, high emotion environment day in, day out. So I think that, we acknowledge that the children themselves present some additional challenges, all of which tend to be really compounded if we don't have good systems and structures in place for supporting staff. And you mentioned about supervision, which is still too uncommon in education, along with a whole raft of things at a structural level, whole school approaches, but even in terms of supporting individuals to know when they're stressed and what works for them.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Lynn, I can see you nodding away there. I'm going to come to you and then come to Elizabeth and Becky after that.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Claire is saying there. And from a mainstream perspective, as a current Senko, I'm also feeling the full force of some of these issues, because we have pupils who we can just about meet needs if we had the right amount of funding and resources. But we know that some of these children need to be in specialist settings. And for example, we had wonderful provision set up for a pupil that needed to be in specialist setting, and had a sort of a rotation of two really wonderful LSAs. One of them is now on long-term sick, so it just takes one cog to be misplaced in that machine, and suddenly that first LSA has got a lot more stress on her and is also suffering as a result of this, of sort of being with that pupil 100% of the time rather than 50% of the time. And then it also has a knock-on effect to all those pupils that she should be also supporting. And I spent 90 minutes with this pupil a couple of weeks ago, and I was exhausted. So I appreciate how she feels doing this the whole time. And although she loves her job and wouldn't want to be doing anything else, yeah, she definitely needs a little bit of TLC.
Thank you. That's lovely, Lynn. Thank you. Elizabeth.
I think one of the key things is that, unlike lots of jobs out there, you really have to be well resourced from a physical point of view, healthy, and from an emotional point of view. And if your cup is running on empty, how can you run, play, listen to, young people talking about mental health issues, suicide ideation, all of those things, if you aren't supported and well in yourself. I think people sometimes underestimate the intensity of, even if you are lucky enough to work in 2-hour shifts with some of our young people. It is something that takes a lot of reserves, a lot of energy, and a very good why, because it's not for the paycheck.
No, the headlines around people move into education and working with special educational needs for the money has not yet been written. You're right. We are definitely not in that space. Really important that you highlight there the need to be well resourced, I think, and I imagine this is something we're going to come back to a little bit later on. Becky, your thoughts on this point around key issues and challenges that you see?
I think similar to what other panelists have said, um, it kind of speaks to compassion fatigue is definitely a concern around staff well-being. I can talk now. I'm still a classroom teacher, and so I'm with my children all day, and it does take a lot. It does indeed. And like Elizabeth said, if your cup isn't full, if you aren't able to feel physically and emotionally well, you get drained really, really quickly. And how to support staff who love their jobs and they want to do it, but how to support them so their cup can stay full so they can keep doing it is definitely a big challenge.
Thanks a million, Becky. Elizabeth, if I can come back to you, and then I'm going to open it out and invite colleagues, other panelists to speak to this as well as they wish. But when we think about staff well-being, do you think that the priorities for staff well-being are different in a special setting, in a special school setting, than they are in mainstream? If we're thinking about SENCOs in a mainstream setting, do they have different needs than staff would in a special school? Or do you think it's the same basic things that we should be doing for both cohorts?
I think there's some overlapping principles, but one of the things that isn't as significant in a special setting is the sense of isolation. And also that often, and you get it in special settings as well, if there's one particular tricky class or set of pupils who are labeled as more challenging. But I think, it can be really isolating in mainstream settings. You're the one or you're the team of 3 in your primary school who work with the pupils with SEND, and you may not have the time before or after school to get resourced, to get trained, to debrief. And so I think there are significant issues around isolation and not feeling as much part of the community within mainstream schools than special.
Yeah, really important. Lynn, I'm going to come to you for an answer to this same question about whether we differentiate or what the priorities might be, but I'm also going to flag to Claire that I would be coming to you, Claire, to just think about when we see it working well, what are we seeing happening around staff well-being? What does good look like in a school where staff well-being is being considered? And Becky, my question to you will be around, if we're thinking about teachers and support staff, again, are we thinking the same way about people, or is there some differentiation in how we should be approaching people? But Lynn, first to you on this point around priorities, what do you think?
I think from my experience with my Senko group, I've asked some questions around this, and teachers and generally and Senkos are very altruistic beings. So I think we put up with a lot of things that other sectors would not necessarily put up with in terms of our personal well-being. But I also feel that in terms of leadership of special education schools, perhaps they are overall, it's a generalization, but more autistic people than perhaps leadership of mainstream schools. And of course, I haven't got any hard facts on that. That's just the feeling I get from talking to my Senkos in my networks. And from that reason, I feel that perhaps in special education, there is that camaraderie. We're all in this together. And in mainstream, quite often it's the leadership team and the head teacher that sets that climate. And if that climate's not right from the top down, then that has a huge impact all the way down to all the LSAs and anybody working in that school as to how they're feeling. On a survey I did with my colleagues in my networks, about 20% of them said that they were happy with the wellbeing support in their school, and the rest, it was sort of ranging from diabolical to average. So that just goes to show how many people are happy within their work at the moment. And I always encourage them to, before giving up on education altogether, try and find a different environment to try out. But ultimately, you are still responsible for your choices. So perhaps it's time to reevaluate your place in that school if it is not a great place to work.
This point about schools being a variable, like not every school is the same, and culture and leadership is so key. You can't have a good setting for anyone in any domain, I guess, without that. But it's a really important point to make. Claire, when we think about looking after staff well, good staff well-being, or attending to staff well-being at least with as much compassion and intention as we can, what do you see that you think, yeah, that's good practice? I think that's stuff we should be seeing more of.
I think there are multiple layers, and going back to what Lynn said about starting with leadership, it not impossible to have staff well-being if you don't have leadership buy-in, but it doesn't have to make it a lot more difficult. And when I say leadership buy-in, it's leaders who are aware of their own needs, their own vulnerabilities, and their own emotional well-being. I think we sometimes see leaders who are fantastic at saying they are attending to everyone else's well-being and possibly are doing that really well, but are exhibiting being hugely stressed people who've given no time to their own self-care. And ultimately, that sort of thing makes a difference to the culture of a school. If the person you're looking to for guidance on looking after your own well-being isn't looking after theirs, I think it filters through. So that leadership is really important. Would really advocate for school leaders having regular supervision, having someone to take the stress and the sort of who they are in the job rather than what they do in the job to someone independent who can hold that for them. I think then having staff well-being distributed as a responsibility across senior and middle leadership is really important as well. I think when we partnered with Education Support Sinead to look at embedding staff well-being, we really noticed how much this was a task that was just dropped on someone, maybe the HR manager or a deputy head or sometimes the head teacher, and it was seen as their job to go and sort it out for everyone. And that's an impossible job. So something where it is recognised it's a shared responsibility, and that extends to being a shared responsibility for all staff. How we feel better at work is going to be really individual. So whilst there are some general things which are really helpful, I think sometimes we make mistakes when we assume that everyone would feel better if they had free gym membership, or everyone would feel better if they got to do X or Y. And some people might feel better as a result of that. But I think what you want is to be able to support people to recognise what are the triggers for them? How do they know when they are feeling like their cup is running dry? What works for them in addressing it, and making sure that you are trying to support them to do that? Because with all the support in the world coming top down, there's still a real responsibility for us as individuals to play in making sure we feel as well as we can.
There's so much in that, Claire, so much thoughtfulness in there. Just going back to your first point around self-care, I was in a room this morning with a fantastic group of assistant and deputy heads talking to them about issues of well-being, and as they step into this phase of their leadership, what they might be thinking about in terms of their own role modeling. And I asked them to put their hands up if they felt like they could say they really were comfortable with looking after themselves and saw that as an important aspect of their professional practice. Not a single hand, not one in the room. And I thought, gosh, these are our young leaders. This is the next generation. So we've got a long way to go before we, I think, really land that. But it's an important point for colleagues here listening that actually that self-care point, beyond giving lip service to it, really substantially sitting with that and thinking, how do I make sure I can be in the best place I can? Actually, for myself, for my family, for the rest of my life, but also because it'll make me a better professional.
Can I just add a line on that?
Yeah.
Because I know often when things feel as if they are going wrong on a number of fronts, sometimes when we can't solve everything, we think it's probably not worth solving the little bit that we can have control of. And I think it's really just to sort of say that any steps towards improving wellbeing are helpful, even if you can't necessarily effect whole system change from where you're at.
I think that's hugely important. We may not be able to make the world better overnight, but that doesn't mean we can't incrementally inch towards something that's a little bit better. Really important. Um, Becky, this point around this comes up a lot in our work, actually, in lots of different places. When we're looking at the well-being of teachers, classroom teachers, and we're looking at the well-being of support staff, there's obviously such a symbiotic relationship anyway between these different professionals in a classroom or in a school setting. But from your perspective, when we're looking at the well-being of those two different groups of staff, are there differences that we need to hold? Is there stuff we should be thinking of, particular priorities you'd flag on that basis?
I think fundamentally, if you are working with students all day, your very core needs are probably very similar. However, what I think would be important to note here is that if you are a teaching assistant or a learning support assistant versus a teacher, sometimes the world sees you differently. So I know as a teacher, sometimes I feel more respected than at times when I've been a teaching assistant and learning support assistant in the past. Also, sometimes if you're a support staff, you might actually spend more one-on-one intense time with students. And so I think it's important to recognize differences in roles and differences in how people might be feeling. If they're feeling not as respected, then that needs to be addressed in its own unique way, rather than pretending that that's not the case. So although I think fundamentally the needs are very similar, we're talking about caring for people all the time and filling our cup, and that kind of is similar. It's important to recognize that there are subtle differences in actually what people's jobs look like, and that can affect what they need. And that if someone's spending all 6-7 hours of the school day with one child, maybe they need a break, which is a little bit different to a classroom teacher who is still spending all their time with the student, but at least it's diffused or spread out a little bit. There's slightly different needs there, and I think it's important to recognize it, because you can hopefully give people a little bit more specific help. If they're just with one student all the time, yeah, maybe they need a break, and that's different to a classroom teacher maybe.
And actually, just bringing awareness to that in the first place seems to be so important, because I'm not sure. I wouldn't make this remark for special schools, but certainly in mainstream settings, it seems to me that sometimes leaders they haven't taken that in. They haven't like really sat with what it means to be doing this job in this way, day in, day out. So I think,
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Can I add on that point? I've definitely experienced that when I worked in a big mainstream secondary and I was a learning support assistant. And sometimes senior staff would talk to me and I'd be like, you have no idea what I do all day. And that is certainly not a way to foster staff well-being. Because if you think someone doesn't know what you do, how can they begin to look after you? And that's a complete opposite end of the spectrum to where I'm at now. And the things that work really well in my school, like we actually have supervision, and my head will come and find me and say, Becky, I think you should have some supervision. Let's talk. And that's amazing. What an amazing feeling that someone, and it's not judgmental. It's not saying you look like you're failing, let me come and talk to you. No, it's going, I actually know you, I know what you do, and this probably was a difficult week, let's talk about it. And that is amazing, and really shows the care, and so you feel cared for then.
lovely, lovely. Thank you, Becky. Elizabeth, I am not going to make you the voice of all leaders because that would be unfair. But I am curious to have your thoughts on if colleagues are sitting listening to this conversation and thinking, I just can't get leadership in our school to take this on board. I can't get them to listen and act. From if you imagine a leader who maybe hasn't been as sensitized to some of these issues, maybe is a little bit less aware, how could staff begin to engage the leadership in thinking differently about these issues and maybe beginning to think about staff well-being in this context?
I think it's really tricky. We're in a time of significant upheaval and turmoil in terms of the Send landscape and messages that are coming out from the government, but also the increased media coverage on the increased number of Send pupils, both in mainstream and needing special schools. And I think what's most important, and I'm working within my own community to get leaders to understand, is for the leaders to accept and understand that we are going to have really difficult young people with challenges that we need to be flexible in approaching within our schools. And this is the complexity. This is what the support looks like. And therefore, you need people who are well resourced, but also well trained,
Yeah.
who have those spaces for debrief. And certainly, I know a lot of both mainstream and special schools who still don't have support staff in particular, talking about support staff in before and after the end of the day. And if you don't have that, it's the most worthwhile thing to start changing contracts and moving towards employing people to have those spaces. Because if you don't have those spaces, how are you going to meaningfully support your staff members to be with their cups filled, to be skilled, etc. And so I think bringing that conversation, going, I don't know if you've seen all of the stuff in the media and the information that's coming out from the government. And this is increasingly going to be our reality. Young people who are biting and throwing and self-harming and all of these elements in our settings, and how are we going to best meet needs while retaining staff and making sure we're doing the best for the child. I'm very happy. I don't care if I get 50 emails to talk to any leaders, to be like, oh, Elizabeth from Forest Bridge is happy to have a chat about what's going on and what strategies she's seen as being effective, because it's just so important. It's important to all of us and all of the young people we're working with.
Let me just say that Elizabeth's made that offer in a room with 230 people. So if that's not generosity, I don't know what is. We'll have to get a t-shirt made for you. Um, I think there's a point in the midst of all of that you said about retaining staff. And I would guess if I was a stressed and harried leader, I would certainly be thinking, like, I want as little staff turnover as I can have in order to smooth the operational part of how the school runs. And I guess that's another way that staff maybe can begin to position some of this, that if we make it a little bit better, Claire's point around, we don't have to change the world overnight, but if we can make it a little bit better, people might stay a little bit longer. Lynn, I wanted to come to you on, so Elizabeth touched there on the hitting, the biting, the various different ways in which we can experience challenging behavior, not all of which, of course, is just physical. But if you are supporting somebody who is a colleague who is dealing with especially challenging behavior, how are you thinking about that? What sort of support are you how are you trying to kind of conceptualize the way in which you support a person then?
This is a tricky one, isn't it? Because there's so many of our LSAs who do this day in, day out for very little pay. And we need to make sure in schools that our school is much nicer than a job in Tesco's, because that's what you're contending with. And so many people, so agency staff, for example, we had a very big turnover of agency staff for a while with this particular pupil because they were not lasting more than a few days. And when that relationship's not built up with that pupil, then it's not going to improve either. So it's that situation where if you're looking after your LSAs, so if you're making sure that they are being released, for example, if there's training going on, on, and all LSAs need to be released for that, not just the people that are not with the one-to-one. So when I took my LSA's place earlier in the term and said I had 90 minutes with this particular pupil, I put my hands up and said, I'm not going to do this very well. It's quite likely that you're going to see me like running around the field after him, quite likely. But if leaders are willing to put themselves in that position and have a go at supporting that pupil, then they're empathizing with the LSA and what they're going through, and the LSA will see that they are well supported at the same time. I mean, it's not obviously ideal if you have to do this day in, day out because of cover issues, but if you're willing to just put yourself out there and give things a go around the school, then I think that speaks a lot. And at the same time, when there's cover needed in schools, that those head teachers that are willing to step into class and do a bit of cover, then that goes a long way with staff wellbeing. But again, at the same time, if that member of staff does need a break because they're with that pupil day in, day out, and just one more hit, one more bite, that's just sent that member of staff over the edge. There does need to be structures in place at school that's going to give that member of staff half an hour time out so that they can just kind of just debrief, take a few deep breaths, and then just that means that they'll be able to go on for longer than if we're expecting them to just be in 24/7 without any breaks, for example. So, and also asking that member of staff what's going to help them as well. So it's not just, again, what we think that they need for their well-being. We need to ask them as well, just to make sure. But at the same time, with recruitment side of things, getting the right people in the right roles is very challenging. And when you've got one that's the right person, then you just need to hang on to them because they're like gold dust.
Absolutely. And I mean, there's a lot in that about collective. There's a lot of culture in that, isn't there? Because there's a lot of empathy required to operate in that way, and the whole business of people being willing to roll their sleeves up, actually, and to get stuck in is a big statement of what kind of place this is to work in. Um, Becky, in your shoes in a classroom, if you're dealing with something that's challenging, that feels like it's outside of your comfort zone or what you're familiar and comfortable to deal with, what kind of support would you ideally want? What makes you feel a bit more grounded in dealing with an issue then?
We have lots of support structures in place in that way, I guess. So, I mean, firstly, on a practical level, we also have either other staff, whether that's senior leaders or other sort of staff that aren't necessarily tied to a class, that can support you in that moment. So if it's a situation where it's about safety and making a situation safe, we always have people we can pull on, so you don't feel alone. I actually work on a different site to our main school site, so you might think, oh, maybe I wouldn't feel that way, but I know I still do, because when we moved, we made sure that there was a system in place so that in a moment, if there was a situation where I needed people, I would have them. And whenever there are difficult situations, and there are hard situations almost every day, because that's the nature of the job, and we actually do stage rate. I think Claire mentioned, no, Elizabeth, sorry, mentioned about not just arriving and leaving at the very start and end of the school day, although it seems really, really counterproductive to say making staff stay later helps staff wellbeing. Because we stay till 5, there is always someone to talk to. You're always going to be there. And generally speaking, if you've had a bad day, you can't just rush off unless you've got an appointment and you've planned it that way. Generally speaking, you're around, and it means people can come and check on you. And I just think that's really important. And there really is a culture of never assuming, just because we've done this 100 times before, that we're okay. I've been here quite a while now. I've seen a lot, I've done a lot, but no one ever assumes that you're okay. They always double check. And that's really important.
Yeah. Again, collegiality. I mean, so
Yeah.
important. And when we research teacher well-being more broadly, this comes out as such a big theme and such an important theme. We've got a question from Amanda in the chat, and Elizabeth and Lynn, I'm wondering if you might want to comment on this, where she's asking, in effect, if you have a student who's, I guess, basically dysregulated, who's not okay, and in her words, well, her question is, in what ways can we diffuse a student so that they're less volatile when they go home, when they leave, maybe after a difficult conversation? What would you be thinking of, Elizabeth, in that situation?
Can I just confirm, because there was a slight cut, that we're talking about calming a pupil who's
Exactly.
highly dysregulated?
Yeah.
Um, Really depends on the individual pupil and where the dysregulation comes from. So I'm a big believer in understanding what the root cause of that is. But a lot of the strategies that I see work across a higher number of pupils will be things like either space and getting some fresh air, walking around the field, walk with me, talk with me. Um, or things like touch, where you, once it's safe to do so, sit down next to them and just put your hand near theirs or on their shoulder, depending on what your relationship and knowledge of the child is, and just having that quiet space, just like you and I would need it if we were um, got in an emotional state and then needed to head back into the classroom. We'd need to re-regulate and calm ourselves. And often it's the same strategies. Some of our more able learners, things like teaching them deep breaths, those sorts of things, the same things that we would do, can really, in a child-friendly way, be transferred to them. But I'm sure there's so many strategies that can be in that suitcase, to take out. But it is knowing your individual pupil, and figuring out what works with them. And if they're able to, when they are regulated, them helping to come up with those ideas is really empowering.
Lovely. And then, Lynn, there's a parallel question that's just come up from a colleague saying, how would we, in a similar way, how would we support a staff member who's not okay? And they're showing signs of not being able to go home well. How would we be supporting them?
Well, I guess first of all, that if they've been brave enough to actually speak out about that, then that's an absolute bonus. And I think we should be really praising them for like coming forward. Although it might be that they haven't come forward and it's been noticed. And I think not leaving it to the next day is really important. So if that staff member has got time to talk it out for a little bit longer so that they can go home with a plan and a positive, then that is brilliant. I've been in a situation before where there was a lady who there's an issue and she misheard something I said and she literally festered all weekend about it, and it wasn't cleared up until the Monday. I was mortified because I hadn't said what she thought I'd said, and she stewed over it all weekend, and I really felt bad for her that she went home and feeling that way, whereas it could have all been cleared up at the time. So I think people often just need to debrief, to de-stress by talking it out and just feeling listened to, in the same way that we deal with challenging parents sometimes who are triggered by various things in school. Once people feel heard and seen and listened to and empathized with, then that definitely that starts to diffuse the situation, and then that means that you can start making a plan going forward. It might be that person might need to sort of step back and take a little bit of a reduced timetable. Perhaps there's a structure in school that means that that can happen for a few weeks, because it'd be better for that staff member to have a reduction for 4 weeks of a day a week than them to burn out completely and have 6 months off, for example. So I think putting those small adjustments in when there is an issue brought up is going to actually support that person long term.
Brilliant.
Can I come in? Because I was
Please.
thinking about fantastic when you get the staff who come to you saying, I'm feeling really bad. But I think we often notice the staff who are really dysregulated. And if you say, how are you? Like, I'm fine. And it really put me in mind of a project I saw last year, as a leadership project for one of our schools, who had a cross-school policy of I'm not fine. So if someone asked you how you were, you could say anything you want apart from fine. And that it created that expectation that people would get in touch with how they were feeling, and it was okay to talk about it, because it is really challenging if someone doesn't necessarily see it themselves. But it's a real risk for them, and it's also quite a risk for their students. We know that staff who are dysregulated are often more likely to restrain students or have difficulties with them. So there's a real school responsibility for getting people in touch with how they're feeling.
think there's still a little bit of a culture in some schools that it's seen as a weakness to need help. So I think that is a big issue in some areas. So I think that certainly needs addressing moving forward, just on a sort of a national level, really. So I thinking back some of the schools I've worked in, unfortunately, there's been situations where I'm not entirely sure who I can trust with my own information about this. So yeah, so that's I think reflecting, and when you've got those home networks that support you as well, then you can also sort of rely on those, and you know, GP side of things as well. So anything that you can do personally to support yourself is really key as well.
I would only take issue, Lynn, with you there that you said there's a little bit of a culture in some schools. And I'd say our research would suggest there's quite a big bit of culture in many
Yeah, I
schools.
was trying to be diplomatic there.
Very, very polite. I love
Yes.
that. Um, Becky, in your role, if you are aware of a young person who's coming to the end of the day and they're not in good shape, or a colleague comes to you with a concern around that, how would you be thinking about that from your perspective as a classroom teacher?
How to support that child.
Yeah.
I think it varies massively on the child. You have to know the children for sure. And we have the luxury often of knowing our children, because we've 60 sort of children in the school, so we know them well, and we can often take a good guess at what the challenges are. Um, if a child comes to you at sort of 3 o'clock and they're due to go home really soon, and they're not in a good way, I would want to ascertain, do we need longer with them? Sometimes we have children that don't go home at the end of the day for various reasons, and maybe we need a little bit longer to work through it. But I would be, and it's also actually similar to if this was a staff member, you'd be finding the people that matter to them. You'd be trying to talk through what's the barrier here, what's happening, and what can we do to make this work for now. And sometimes, you know, if you're talking about going home at the end of the day, you need a quick short-term plan of what we're going to do now. So today you're going to feel okay, and that could be, we're going to book a meeting for tomorrow so we can talk about it bigger, or it could be you've got a class, a youth club tonight, and that's going to get you through. You know, it can be, sometimes it can be things like that. And then I think you want to check in with them at a later time. And I actually almost think staff and students is bizarrely similar in a way, that you need to find out what's causing a blockage, and you need to find safe people for them as well. Because I think even if you're in a school where the culture is really good, you're still not comfortable necessarily talking to anyone and everyone. So knowing the right people is really important. But it's so tricky because every child and every staff member would require a slightly different approach. But essentially, you've got to find what's stopping them and talk about it.
Thank you, Becky. Claire, it seems I'm no expert in this at all, and obviously I spend my life talking to education staff around their experience of working in schools and other settings, and what doesn't work, and what isn't easy, and why they might be leaving, and all that kind of stuff. But it seems to me as an amateur that as we look to the future and see what's coming, you know, Elizabeth shared a view of this is what's coming down the pipeline in terms of what we can expect to see presenting in all classrooms. It seems to me a no-brainer that mainstream has got a lot of opportunity actually to learn from special schools and to learn from the experience of colleagues in the special school sector. I just wonder if you think 10 years out, what do you see in that way?
I might have a different answer based on what I'd like to see versus if I've got my jaded cup half empty cynical head on. I'll try and give you the former version. I think there are huge opportunities for special and mainstream schools to work together. There's a whole set of things coming up in the chat, largely from special schools, talking about good levels of support and the way that they work to support their staff. You know, we're not perfect as a sector. There will be special schools who get it wrong and where staff don't feel supported. But I do think that we could take that model into mainstream schools more. We know that mainstream schools, if the government has its way, are going to be supporting far more of the children who are currently in special. So there's a real need for getting the two groups to work together. and to have ongoing meaningful relationships. Often we reduce it to, well, if the staff from the special school went in and gave a bit of training to the mainstream school, everything would be fine. We're not talking just about training. That definitely has its place, but it's that relationship, because what we've heard time and time again today is the importance of relationship between staff and students, between staff and staff, between staff and leadership. And something where there's an ongoing relationship between special and mainstream schools really would be a benefit, I think, to both sides. I mean, special schools have also got a lot to learn from mainstream, particularly around subject specialism. So forging those links, I think, will be important. We've definitely got a government that is thinking more about resourced units and creating almost mini special schools in mainstream schools. I really hope that they will invest in some of the cultural change that will go with it.
Really important stuff. And actually, and Elizabeth, I'm interested in your thoughts on this, because it seems to me that one of the things I hear, and this isn't scientific, because we haven't cut the data this way, but it seems to me that there's something in the empathic leadership skill set, relational leadership skill set. Sometimes leadership cultures are leadership and cultures are super. Oftentimes in mainstream settings, they're not. And some of that, I think, is a product of the compliance in the system, but also it's a very unforgiving system. There's an awful lot being rammed through very quickly. So it sort of removes some of the humanity. But if you were thinking about the ideal leadership skills for running a team with care and compassion, what would you be thinking about?
I think it's making yourself relatable, um, and and being able to ally yourself across the staff within your school. One of the things that kicks up at all levels of leadership, from class leadership to middle and senior, is when we're trying to create a culture of openness and well-being and asking for help, is being willing. And I've stood in front of my large staff team and said, you might have noticed last month I wasn't necessarily walking with the same skip in my movement as I normally do. I was struggling with this. This is what I did. And being able to give some of those relatable stories, those elements to say, I know that it's difficult. I know that sometimes we have to dig deep. I know sometimes we have to go stomp in a cupboard, or at right after the day, put on some heavy metal and bang it out, in terms of just releasing that stress. And I think if we can get I think you're right. There's a little bit of a culture of leaders and them in some schools. And if you can be that person who jumps in and, helps with a little one, or, gives that break because someone's just gotten hurt, even if you don't do that all the time, it goes so far. Those times you do jump in, or you do share that personal story that allows people to see you as human, as well as their big boss, their mentor, whatever it might be.
Lovely. Thank you. I think there was also a point, and we had a conversation in advance of this event, but we talked about retention, and we talked about retention strategies for support staff. Does anybody want to say anything about that? I mean, I'm mentioning support staff particularly. Clearly, we've got retention issues across the whole gamut of the workforce, but thinking about special schools, and how are you thinking about retention right now?
Can I say, but we've just this year started a project thinking about how schools approach particularly retention, but recruitment as well.
Yeah.
If you look in industries other than education, there's been a huge amount of investment in understanding your workforce, understanding what makes them tick, understand what's rewarding for them, and understanding those who are at risk of burnout. So we can use quite basic psychometrics and have a good idea of the staff who are going to be at particular risk. And then we can do something about it. So we are supporting a group of 6 schools to really delve into using psychometrics in the workforce and then coming up with strategies that support their whole staff. And I think education's probably going to have to move more in that direction. If you think we still see recruitment as we write a nice advert, people apply, we'll do an interview, and that will sort everything. And I think that probably isn't fit. If it was ever fit for schools, it isn't fit for schools as they are now and will be into the future.
I would just add to that we find one of the most important things is career pathways and investment in growth. And also people, again, that culture of feeling valued. The number of staff who I've had in the last 10 years who have left, having not ever worked in school sector before, and said, this is not happening, and then have come back because of the focus we put on valuing our staff and investing in them. I think is really reinforcing for me as a leader, but I think shows, a pathway, and something around those psychometrics is also that will give the information about what sorts of professional development will really benefit the person, and that can be hugely insightful, because again, it's not one size fits all.
No, not at all. There's a lot more. I mean, I think we could talk about this for quite a long time, but I think there's I'm going to draw us in. Jen, who is listening and is on the call, somebody's asked for the data there. I imagine that I would have referred to things in the Teacher Wellbeing Index. Would you kindly post a link for all participants to that, Jen? Thank you. So colleagues, I'm going to start with Lynn and then Becky and then Elizabeth and finish with Claire. I'm going to ask you for, your pearl of wisdom. If you wanted people to walk away from this webinar knowing one thing about staff well-being, or taking one thing away that they can really hold on to. And of course, Claire, you've got the short straw here because you're going last, and your first 3 points are going to be taken by the others. So I'm sorry about that. But it would be really nice to hear what you would really like people to take away, please, Lynn.
So my mantra from my sort of positive young mind side of things is I've got like a lobster pincer movement. So there's top down well-being from like your CEOs and your schools and your leaders, and then you've got bottom up the other end, because it's all about you and empowering yourself. So I think as a workforce overall, we just need to start being a little bit less agreeable. So I sort of encourage people to be 20% less agreeable in what they say yes to. That's one thing. And that way we can kind of nationally try and push things towards having schools which are a lot more person-centered. And I think the schools that get it right are actually thinking about children at the core, and not what Ofsted and those external things and the governors want them to do. So yeah, definitely a sort of a pincer movement of top down and bottom up to support yourself.
Sounds like some good boundary setting to me.
I don't always live by my own advice, by the way. So.
No, but you have left us with a lobster image really powerfully, so that's good. Thank you. Becky.
So good well-being can come from within. You matter. You need to know how you feel, and you need to know, if you can't trust everyone, then who are the people you can. So when you feel out of balance, when you feel it's not quite right, when you're waking up in the middle of the night because you're having dreams about things that are happening, know in yourself that that's not okay, that you matter, what you feel is valid, and that you can go and talk to someone, and normally you can talk it out and your well-being will improve. But know that you can do that for yourself.
That's powerful stuff, Becky. And I will say to colleagues again, our 08000 562 561 number, should you wake in the middle of the night, should you be needing to talk, is available 24/7. There's always someone there to talk in the moment that you need it. Powerful, important stuff, reminding us how important we are and recognizing where we are is. Elizabeth.
I think, changing the language changing how you're framing things, focusing on, the goal, the why of helping pupils with SEND versus the challenges, the problems, the trickiness, etc., can really have a significant impact on well-being. If you change that language and you focus on the positive, you focus on what we can do and that why, you can bring people's well-being really up. And as one of my favorite people, Maya Angelou, says, you can then be the rainbow in somebody else's cloud. And I think we can model that at all levels, and it can have such an impact.
Brilliant. Of course, that strong sense of purpose is critical to personal well-being, and knowing that we can make a difference, which everybody in this room who is working with children and young people and those who have additional needs is really making the world a better place in that moment. Thank you, Elizabeth. So Claire, you probably had all those points. You probably started with a lobster,
Oh,
but here you are.
Lobsters, I was just about to talk about them. I think if you have got to that point where you have managed to fill your cup, acknowledge your feelings, get support for them, and you still find you've got a bit of energy, and you're tired of being a rainbow, be a lightning bolt. Help us, help education support, lobby for this becoming the norm in education, because your voices are really important. I know that Sinead spends a lot of time trying to get government to listen. NASS spends a lot of time trying to get government to listen. Your voices are really important. So, keep posting on the Sweary Senko, keep posting on social media. I think various of us have made offers of contact. Raise your issues so we can keep raising them for you.
That's lovely, Claire. And I think this is how culture changes. Culture is all these small moments of different interactions between people and across a profession and in our schools locally, but also here and this group of people. So I really endorse that. I think that we're not going to make radical change overnight, but we can, as a collective force, begin to turn the tide and make improvement. And that will change the lives of children and young people across the country. So thank you all.